everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I want to talk about the concepts of victimhood and trauma here in 2021, the ways in which our society kind of holds these concepts up on a pedestal. A lot of people manipulate and use it for their own benefit. A lot of politicians wage victimhood as a way to avoid accountability, and everyday people using these concepts to gain power. I'm also going to be talking about some social media aspects of victimhood and trauma, namely on Tumblr and Tik Tok. I'm going to talk about how the expanding definition of trauma over time is likely doing more harm than good, as well as how the increased social power around terms like victimhood are likely harming us. And then finally, to close it off, I'm going to be talking about the dark side of the Me Too movement and how a cause that seemed to be noble in its aims at the beginning has kind of been abused and reappropriated in some kind of awful ways. So more on that at the end. And then of course I'm going to distinguish between people who actually go through trauma and victimhood and people who fake it for clout or political power, and why I think our society's emphasis on trauma rather than recovery is doing a lot of harm. So if you're interested in any of those topics, just keep watching. So to begin with, I kind of want to define victimhood culture and what I mean when I say that our society embraces victimhood in a way that it hasn't before. And to help explain this, I'm going to be referencing the sociologists Manning and Campbell and kind of the work that they've done on cultures and how they evolve over time. And their definition of victimhood is: culture of victimhood is one characterized by concern with status and sensitivity to slight combined with a heavy reliance on third parties. People are intolerant of insults, even if unintentional, and react by bringing them to the attention of authorities or to the public at large. Domination is the main form of deviance, and victimization a way of attracting sympathy, so rather than emphasize either their strength or inner worth, the aggrieved emphasize their oppression and social marginalization. And of course, the main thing people think about when they think about victimization and victimhood culture is identity politics. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get into that in this video because it would literally take up the whole video, but there is one coming on that, so stay tuned. But according to these sociologists, there are three main cultures that arise in regards to how people deal with victimization and personal insult. The first kind of culture is called an honor culture, in which people are very sensitive to slights and act out in physical violence constantly. For instance, these are cultures in which if you insult the alpha male or any male leader, he is likely to just beat you up or kill you. There's a lot of violence waged to maintain a social order, and it's all very volatile. But when it comes to the 20th century, Campbell and Manning recognize a shift from honor cultures into dignity cultures, in which people aren't as offended by words. They come up with the whole sticks and stones break your bones phrase. And part of the way why people are able to get less offended and not feel like they have to prove their worth by lashing out in violence is the increase in third parties that they can go to when a dispute becomes unmanageable. In dignity cultures, most conflicts are resolved person to person. Most offenses and slights aren't seen as a big deal, and when they are and the person really needs help, they have law enforcement to call on, they have the legal system, they have communities, they have other ways of addressing the issue. But when it comes to the 21st century, these sociologists notice a shift into victimhood culture, where instead of an emphasis being on strength and inner worth, it's more about oppression and power. And it's similar to honor cultures in that way, where people are very easily offended, but they also take the third party aspects of the dignity culture and constantly air out their problems to social media, to the mainstream media, to teachers and professors, to the HR department, all of this kind of thing. And the emphasis often isn't on resolving conflicts, it's more about recognizing that person's victimhood and acting out in a more aggressive way to the perpetrator. And I feel like this shift probably most notably happened around the 1990s when people started suing people for absolutely everything. This was a huge thing back then. If you ask anybody above 40, they remember this. I'm not making it up. But back around the 1990s, people were just constantly suing or threatening to sue people for the most minor aggravations. And it makes sense because people realize that if they victimize themselves and successfully sue someone, particularly a corporation, they could get a lot of money in return. And victimhood in that way kind of became a way to gain power. And I think now in the 2020s, with the rise of technology and how much stuff is thrown at us in terms of advertising and innovation and all this crazy chaos with the pandemic and everything, people feel really out of control of their own lives. And when people don't feel in control of their own lives, they're more likely to feel like victims and feel like they have no say in the things going on to them and that everything is done to them rather than them being a part of everything that's happening. And of course, our online culture is very obsessed with validation. We live in an attention economy, and people realize that by victimizing themselves, by making outlandish claims, by canceling others, by taking offense to the minor slights, they could get a lot of attention on social media for this. And I think that also perpetuates the problem. We've also seen a rise lately in mental health issues, even narcissism and anxiety, and I think this also leads to more feelings of being personally persecuted by everything and taking everything personal, which leads to self-victimization and lashing out at others. When it comes to the victimhood mindset as a psychological state, I want to read this quote from Scientific American describing kind of the nuances of this condition. It states, "Those who have a perpetual victimhood mindset tend to have an external locus of control. They believe that one's life is entirely under the control of forces outside oneself, such as fate, luck, or the mercy of other people. Based on clinical observations and research, the researchers found that the tendency for interpersonal victimhood consists of 4 main dimensions. A, constantly seeking recognition for one's victimhood. B, moral elitism. C, lack of empathy for the pain and suffering of others. And D, frequently ruminating about past victimization." It's important to point out that the researchers do not equate experiencing trauma and victimization with possessing the victimhood mindset. They point out that a victimhood mindset can develop without experiencing severe trauma or victimization. Vice versa, experiencing severe trauma or victimization doesn't necessarily mean that someone is going to develop a victimhood mindset. And I think what's most interesting to me about this definition is the moral purity aspect of it. I know this is something I talk about a lot, that when it comes to cancel culture, I feel like a lot of people do this to try to absolve themselves of their own sins or feelings of guilt or feelings of low self-worth by pretending that they are perfect and that they're oppressed and that by lashing out at others, they're kind of absolving themselves of their own faults. And then of course, when it comes to playing the victim in daily life, a lot of people do this to not take accountability for their actions. We see this on YouTube a lot when YouTubers have to do their apologies, and a lot of the times it's not a real apology, they're just making excuses. Playing victim helps you not take responsibility because when you're the victim, that means automatically you're not in the wrong because you're basically asserting that you didn't do anything. You're just kind of the subject of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or whatever. And now that I've kind of defined victimhood culture a little bit, I want to talk about trauma and the changing definitions of the term trauma over time. Because changing the definition of trauma and what constitutes trauma, I think has a real effect on the way people perceive, aspects of their life. I think it causes people more pain than healing when they view things as trauma that aren't necessarily trauma. So the term trauma has existed for a very long time, I think back around the ancient Greek era. And back then, it only referred to physical traumatic events, hitting your head, breaking your leg, losing an arm, that kind of thing. And trauma wasn't used to refer to mental injuries rather than physical until the 1980s in the DSM-3, where post-traumatic stress disorder was defined as experiencing traumatic events outside of the normal human experience, such as war. And the criteria for this condition were very strict, with a qualifying event having to evoke significant distress in almost anyone and be outside of the range of normal human experience, meaning divorce can't be seen as trauma, losing a loved one would not be trauma because even though these are sad, it's not outside of the realm of normal experience like something like war would be. But towards the turn of the century, trauma started being defined as, quote, a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful, which gives trauma a subjective standard. It's up to the individual to decide what is trauma, what is emotionally difficult and emotionally harmful. And whenever a word with a strict definition becomes watered down to become subjective, this automatically leads to overuse, overprescription. People start regarding things as trauma as they otherwise wouldn't have, and we see this now because as of the DSM-5, there have been statistics showing that around 90% of Americans have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetime, versus back in the day it would be a significantly smaller figure. And 90% of people having experienced trauma is like the literal opposite of the original definition of trauma, which meant something outside of the realm of human experience. I imagine when they say 90% of people have experienced trauma, they're talking about how the way we use it now, where everything's trauma. Childhood neglect, a hard breakup, divorce, losing a sibling or a parent. And while these situations are hard and difficult and emotionally draining, viewing them as trauma, I feel like can do more harm than good because it changes the way that we frame these situations and can kind of make us view them as worse and more harmful and render us more helpless than they would otherwise. I'm now going to read a section from an article in the Chicago Tribune called "The Problem with Defining Every Misfortune as Trauma." That article states, "Our choice of language matters. A famous study by cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus illustrates why. Loftus showed people films of traffic accidents and asked them to judge the speed of the cars involved using subtly varying instructions. Different study participants were asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed, collided, bumped, hit, or contacted each other. Despite watching the very same collisions, people judged the cars to be traveling 28% faster when they were described as smashing rather than contacting. To define all adversities as traumas is akin to seeing all collisions as smashes. People collide with misfortune all the time. Sometimes it smashes them, but often they merely make contact. And I think this is really important to distinguish because with everything being seen as trauma, like if you go to a therapist and you tell them kind of a normal experience a person would have that's difficult to deal with, and they start defining it as trauma, you might take it as being something a lot more difficult to get over and work through than you would otherwise. And we also see language play out in the discourse around trauma and victimhood in terms of rape survivors. The kind of debate going on of whether you should call them victims or survivors, it really depends on the individual, what they're most comfortable with. Obviously, if you're a victim of sexual assault, you're a victim, so that term makes sense. But I also understand why people would rather say survivor, because survivor focuses on overcoming a certain trauma, whereas victimhood has a feeling of helplessness associated with it. And you could simultaneously be a victim of, some kind of crime and also be a survivor. It just kind of depends how far along the spectrum you are in terms of recovery. The increased emphasis on trauma within therapeutic circles also has caused a lot of damage over the years. Over in the 80s and 90s, there were record amounts of children falsely accusing their parents of sexual abuse. This happened primarily alongside the Satanic Panic, if you want to look that up. But what would happen is that a child would go in for therapy or some kind of session with a psychologist. They would ask a bunch of leading questions. Children will answer pretty much any question, regardless of whether it makes sense or not. And if you're fishing for something, kids can normally tell if there's a certain answer that they want or not. And basically, a lot of children were being led to admit to being abused or having false memories of being abused because of these leading questions and these now considered malpractice therapeutic practices. And unfortunately, a lot of parents were put into jail before the children could recant their statements or grow up and, figure out that this is kind of a hoax. There are literally formations for people who were falsely accused of rape by their children during this era. And a lot of this practice, especially among adolescents and young adults, was through a practice called recovered memory therapy or something that you will now literally get sued for if you practice this because it's been debunked and it obviously caused a lot of harm, where the increased focus on trauma as being the cause of mental illness and childhood trauma specifically, which is a very Freudian idea, was kind of the central belief of a lot of therapists in the 80s and 90s. And they would kind of lay people down and try to have them bring up repressed memories that they didn't know that they had to try to explain kind of the maladaptive mental illnesses that they had. And as you might assume, unfortunately, people would uncover repressed memories that are false, not real memories, and falsely accuse family members of sexual abuse. And while of course this is really tragic, a lot of research has since been done on false memories and how false memories are developed and the suggestibility of patients, particularly patients who are in such a weak, vulnerable mental state that they're going to a therapist in the first place, and how susceptible people can be to implanted memories. There's been a lot of groundbreaking research on there as a result of these horrific incidents. But the reason that I bring this up is that the overemphasis on trauma, particularly trauma as being the root of all your problems, and the idea that we have to work through all of our traumas in order to be a whole, healthy person, can lead a lot of people to have an overemphasis on trauma and how trauma affects their lives that they wouldn't otherwise, particularly when literally everything can be seen as trauma nowadays. And while this false memory kind of digging up repressed memories practice is no longer allowed, therapists, in my opinion, and in the opinions of my friends who have gone, there's still a huge emphasis on trauma as being kind of a defining aspect of who you are as a person. When I went to therapy, the first thing they asked me was what kind of trauma I've experienced in my life and if I've had a big trauma that's affected me. And I've had other friends tell me that when they tell their therapist that there's not one big event that can kind of explain what's wrong with them, the therapists almost seem disappointed. And it also makes sense for people to want to find some kind of trauma to explain their mental illness, because in a way it's kind of a simpler answer than the answer for a lot of people, which is just that it's very complicated, that there are a lot of environmental factors that led for you to have certain conditions, that not every maladaptive behavior that you have can be chalked up to one big traumatic incident. But when people really want to get better and figure out what's wrong with them, the idea of having one big traumatic event that ruined you is easier to conceptualize and to deal with than having a multitude of factors that you can't really place. And after I first started going to therapy, I'll admit it, I actually would sit down and try to uncover repressed memories that I might have, and there was nothing. And I don't think you could really force those out of you if you have them anyway. But I was looking for some kind of big event that made me the way that I am. But unfortunately, it's not always that simple. I think it helps in some ways. It's nice to be able to understand our emotional experiences, and maybe broadening that definition helps us understand the way that we process grief more. But it also comes with its downsides. And of course, I'm going to be talking about trauma on social media, TikTok and Tumblr, and self-harm groups on those websites and so on. on later on. But first I want to do a quick section on some of the political usages of victimhood. So unfortunately, a lot of people in the media use victimhood status as a way to deflect from wrongdoings that they've done. For instance, if you critique anyone who happens to be a woman, you're automatically a misogynist. If you critique anyone who is not white, you're automatically a racist, regardless of whether you're critiquing the content of their character or the actual words or actions they've done or not. For instance, if you criticize Hillary Clinton, who is literally one of the most powerful women in the entire world, automatically it's because you hate women, it's because you're a misogynist. I remember during the 2020 election, I think, or maybe 2016, when Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were both on the ticket. So many people were saying that because Bernie and Elizabeth are exactly the same, which is not true. If you vote for Bernie instead of Elizabeth, it's because you hate women and you're a misogynist. Like, this was an actual thing that people were saying, which is absolutely insane. And also, I never understand why people assert other people to be victims when they're not. Elizabeth Warren, I don't think, has ever claimed to be a victim of misogyny, though maybe she has. But using victimhood and the notion of oppression as a way to kind of attack other people for having different political beliefs than you or different opinions than you is an aspect of victimhood culture that I feel like we see a lot. But one case of someone in the media using victimhood that I want to talk about is Taylor Lorenz. And Taylor Lorenz, in case you don't know, is a New York Times journalist, I guess, who falsely accused someone of using the word retarded in a private group chat. Which, first of all, even if someone said retarded in a private group chat, how is that journalism? How are you getting paid for this? I'm sure she's getting a great salary working for the New York Times. Really? Like if I find a bunch of people online who say the word retarded and put them on blast, can I make that kind of money? But basically, she accused someone of using the word retarded. Turns out that they didn't. And she was literally lying, and a bunch of online harassment happened because of this. And she's also been accused of harassing a lot of other people online. She's kind of a Twitter person. And then instead of taking accountability and, apologizing to the person, she utilized International Women's Day to spread awareness to the online hate women get and the harassment that they get online. And she talks about, how hard it is for her to be harassed online by people who are critiquing her for literally lying about something. And the whole thing, of course, is so ironic because she literally is an online harasser, but she's playing the victim and the woman card to try to get out of any kind of accountability. I also don't understand women who play the victim or try to get people to infantilize them when they're literally middle-aged. She's 36 years old. Why is she pretending to be a little girl who can't make her own decisions and is just always the one being wronged? That makes no sense to me. And a quote I want to read about this case that I feel like is spot on comes from Glenn Greenwald's Substack. He says, "It is an immense privilege to have a large platform that you can utilize to shape the society around you, reach large numbers of people, and highlight injustices you believe are being neglected. Those who have that and who earn a living by pursuing their passion to use it are incredibly fortunate. Journalists who are murdered or imprisoned or prosecuted for their work are victims of real persecution. Journalists who are maligned with words are not, especially when those words come not from powerful state officials, but from random people on the internet." And he also goes on to talk about if you want to be a journalist or a political figure, literally your job is for people not to like you. That's kind of comes with the territory. No one can be liked by everyone, and the more power you have, the less right you have to pretend to be a victim when people on Twitter call you out for literally lying about someone and starting an online harassment campaign. And then when it comes to other people in the media using trauma as a way to kind of gain support, there's the whole AOC scandal where she is talking about the Capitol Hill riots and how traumatized she was for an hour and a half on Instagram when it turns out she was literally not even in the building. She wasn't even there. And maybe it was traumatic. She was not in the Capitol, but she was a quarter mile away in a different building. Maybe she didn't like all the sounds that she was hearing or whatever. And she tries to justify it later, saying that there was no safe space in the area, and then kind of calls for political action to be taken against Senator Ted Cruz and some other senators. But the thing is, when a politician is kind of yielding their trauma or their victimhood and kind of exploiting it, maybe they're just sharing it, maybe they're good-natured, but whenever a politician is doing something like this, you have to be skeptical because politicians will literally do anything to garner support, whether it's lying, whether it's exaggerating, whether it's engaging in petty fights with people who they're against. You always have to be skeptical when it comes to politicians. And of course, victimization is natural in politics. Trump is always talking about how the media hates him and he's a victim of the media and the election was stolen and he was disgraced. Everyone uses victimization to some degree within politics because it's a very useful rhetorical tool. But I think in our society, especially right now in the current climate, we really have to be aware of this and be able to dismantle it and see when it's bullshit or not. But now I want to talk about mental health and trauma and social media groups. I'm mainly going to be talking about Tumblr because that's what I have experience in, but I have heard that a lot of these communities are emerging now on TikTok. Basically, people share their trauma online a lot, and certain communities can evolve around this kind of hardship. Back on Tumblr, which I don't even know know if that website exists anymore, but back on Tumblr, there were a lot of groups like the Pro-Ana group for anorexics and self-harm groups and so on. And I was a lurker back in the day. I never had an account for those purposes, but I would lurk all the time. And in these communities, for instance, the Pro-Ana community, people would give each other tips on how to starve themselves. If you post a photo, people might be like, well, you look kind of fat, even if you're very thin, and kind of give you tips on how to starve more and try to convince you to starve yourself more. And it was kind of a support group. It was like a group for anorexics to encourage each other's anorexia. And then when it comes to self-harm as well, there were a lot of self-harm groups where people would post pictures of their self-harm and people would reblog it and so on. But one of the toxic aspects of this culture, if you don't want to just say the entire thing is toxic, which it probably is. But the thing about these groups is the most shocking and the most traumatic and the most horrible kind of images are the ones that got reblogged the most, and those are the people who were the most popular on the platform. But for instance, people who would cut themselves a lot more and were bleeding a lot more in their photos would get more reblogs and support and attention than people who didn't have as gory kind of photos of themselves. And so in these groups, trauma kind of became a competition of who had it the worst, who is the biggest self-harmer, who is the thinnest anorexic. It's very toxic, and there was a total race to the bottom mindset there. And one of the difficult parts about leaving these groups is that these are people who understand you when it feels like the society at large doesn't, who understands anorexia better than anorexics. If you want to heal and recover, you are cutting yourself off from so many people who know you, who you talk to, who you have this group with. And those people can really get in your head too, the way that they speak, until it's almost a part of you. And the reason I bring up this aspect of Tumblr is because I hear that it's become a thing on TikTok now, where people are broadcasting their traumas all the time, getting attention for their hardships, kind of using that as a way to get views. And a lot of communities like the Pro-Ana community have certain iterations on TikTok where people are still encouraging bad behaviors within each other. And the whole thing is obviously an issue, and it's very much exemplified by social media. I'm gonna read some posts that I saw on Instagram of people talking about this trend on TikTok, because again, I don't have TikTok, I can't figure it out. I don't think I want to get it. I feel like it's going to ruin my life. Let me know down below. But the post I saw that the comments I want to read from states, the way that people talk about trauma on this app genuinely inspires me to recover just because of how much I do not want to be associated with you people. And then when it comes to comments on this post, the first one that I saw says, literally though, they all seem so anti-recovery, it's insane. Sometimes I feel genuinely guilty about getting more mentally stable because I feel like I'm going to get made fun of or completely cut off from everyone around me. And then the person under says, I mean, trauma at this point isn't even shared for support. It's become a complete competition on whose experience was worse. This is literally why I stopped looking at self-harm support groups. They act as if it's some sort of requirement to be cool. They also act as if having traumatic experiences benefits them. My trauma made me hot. My trauma made me funny. No, Emily, trauma is something that will poison you, your life, and your relationships until you recover from it. Also, the trauma they talk about is something like their parents telling them to do chores. Which, as a side note, I've seen a lot of people compare traumas online and claim to have trauma that is totally not trauma. For instance, I was reading a comment section where people were talking about, for instance, being beaten up by their parents, these kinds of experiences. And I literally saw someone respond saying, well, you can't dismiss other people's trauma just because it's not the same as yours. Like, I'm traumatized because my uncle talks about Trump at the dinner table, even though he knows it makes me upset. And it's like, sweetie, that's not trauma. Hearing someone's political opinion you don't agree with is not a traumatic event. And when trauma becomes subjective like this, where everything is trauma so long as you feel emotionally harmed by it, this kind of watering down, like I mentioned earlier, can dilute the meaning so much that people who actually have experienced trauma can't get the help that they need because everyone feels like they're equally oppressed based on their life experiences. But to continue reading on from this commenter, her comment literally has almost 2,000 likes, which is really telling, and she says, also to add on, they like to guilt trip the mentally stable people on TikTok. They'll view people who have no mental issues as inferior to them because, supposedly, mental issues make you cultured and less basic. If you are mentally okay, you're basic and don't have any right to struggle or feel any type of negative emotion, and that's why I think there's a lot of people who want mental issues or pretend to have one so they don't get labeled basic. All they want is to fit in, SMH. And this has been a thing for me growing up as well, late adolescence, early adulthood. People wanting to have mental illness or viewing their mental illness as quirky, as character building, as something kind of as an aesthetic that they have, rather than what it actually is, which is an illness. And then I guess on TikTok as well, there are videos of people dancing where they share their traumas on the screen, and these obviously get reblogs and likes and whatnot. And it's one thing to talk about your emotional experiences, and I do genuinely appreciate how open Gen Z are about talking about mental health issues and their experiences. I do think it has a lot of positive benefit. When it comes to social media and broadcasting your trauma on social media for reblogs and views and whatnot, It's inherently tied in with the attention economy. It's inherently tied in with attention-seeking behavior and validation. If people see someone getting a lot of likes for sharing their trauma, someone else might make up a trauma or exploit their own traumas or a friend's traumas in order to get the same amount of validation. And this ultimately really doesn't do any good. If you're dancing around sharing your trauma on TikTok, maybe you should go to therapy instead. And that's the other aspect, I'm obviously all about dark humor. I don't think there's anything that people shouldn't be able to joke about, regardless of who you are, which some people don't agree with, but that's how I feel about it. But if you're spending all your time in these support groups making jokes about your mental illness or your eating disorder and so on, and just kind of riding on the validation from others and the attention from others, instead of actually working on your problems, this doesn't help. Dancing on a TikTok isn't going to solve your issues. If you are going through actual trauma and victimization, you probably need professional help. It's really hard to get through that kind of thing on your own. Even if you have the victimhood mindset without being a victim, that kind of thing needs a lot of therapy to get through also. Social media isn't a substitute for professional help, and it's kind of upsetting to see people use it as if it is, or to feel like they don't need to go to therapy or get help with their mental illness because they have people online who understand them. When no, you need to break those patterns. You need to find a new way to live your life. It's not easy, but it's really necessary. And I don't think that joking around on social media all the time is really helping you. But in this next section, I want to talk about male self-victimization. Obviously, men don't use victimhood to their advantage as much as women. Women can lie about being victims or over-exaggerate their victimhood in order to gain sympathy, attention, power, etc. Men don't really get away with this because literally when men are actual victims, they're not even taken seriously, which is really fucked up, but unfortunately that's how it is. So a man can't, be on Twitter saying, you all are misandrists for harassing me. It's because you hate men. They're not going to be taken seriously at all. And even when it comes to Me Too allegations, a man is much less likely to be taken seriously making those against a woman than a woman is against a man, even before any sort of due process has begun. But naturally, life is a spectrum. People on both sides love to wage victimhood for their personal gain. One of the men I'm going to talk about is Jussie Smollett, which if you want to hear about the case in a more entertaining way, definitely watch the Dave Chappelle bit on it if you haven't seen it already. But basically, this Jussie Smollett guy was an actor on some show. He's gay and black, and he literally faked a hate crime in the middle of the night in Chicago. He bought props, he wrapped a noose around his neck, went to the police, said that these MAGA hat guys were calling him a faggot and beating him up and trying to lynch him, and it was later proven that he was literally lying. And unfortunately, these kinds of lies are nothing new, really. People kind of lie about things all the time for attention, but naturally faking a hate crime is pretty egregious. I don't know if he did this for political purposes to try to make people be like, oh, Trump sucks, I can't believe his supporters are so racist, or if it was just for attention and sympathy, which it most likely was, in my opinion. But again, I'm not him. I'm not like that. I don't know why he would do this, but I do know that there are people like this. Even growing up, you meet people who are totally psychopathic liars who will just lie about anything for attention and just cry and hurt people and pretend like they're the victim all the time. It's some weird kind of trait that certain people have, and it's really upsetting to come across. But the other aspect of male self-victimization I want to talk about that's a little bit more broad is around the incels, and I know the incels hate it when I talk about them, but sorry guys, you guys kind of fall under this. And the reason I want to talk about incels in regards to self-victimization is because I feel like it can kind of highlight the psychology of why people stay within the victimhood mindset, even if it's just prolonging their own suffering or they're just adding to their own suffering. And so basically the incels are a bunch of angry virgins who feel like the world is conspiring against them and that they'll never be able to get laid because either women are evil and whores, women are simultaneously whores yet will not fuck them, which just perpetuates their own feelings of low self-worth, because if you can't even get a whore to fuck you, wow. But that's the way that they feel about themselves. They blame the world for their problems and they feel like they're never going to get laid. And they just kind of dwell on these feelings of low self-worth and just re-perpetuate those feelings over and over again. And again, as with the Tumblr communities, incels have communities online, very tight-knit communities. And if you want to stop being an incel and improve yourself and go and work on yourself and become an attractive partner, you risk losing your entire friend and social group. But the reason why I think people self-victimize, not just incels, but anyone who has depression or is just feeling stuck in their life and anxious, whether they're mad about their dating life or they can't get a better job than the one they have and they just can't seem to get over it. They're just always dwelling it for years and years. Number one, a lot of this, of course, is depression, which is complicated, but also self-victimizing kind of gives you an easy way out of having to do the hard work to change. Whether it's subconsciously or consciously, it makes sense to always feel like the victim and feel like the world is against you and there's literally nothing you could do about it, rather than have to put in all the hard work and risk rejections and risk failures over and over again until you've improved. Because that's necessarily what improvement entails. For the majority of the incels, I would assume if they put as much effort into improving themselves as they do into hating on themselves, literally just hating themselves, if they put that effort into getting a hobby, getting a nice job, working on their appearance, becoming sociable, talking to women, asking women on dates, getting rejected a few times but getting over it, building up a core of self-worth and confidence, they wouldn't have a problem getting laid. It wouldn't even be an issue. And if it doesn't work from you, you could just lower your expectations. I'm sorry, like, you can get laid. You could even buy a prostitute if you have to. But the idea that, oh, I'm so worthless, I'll never get laid, I'll always be a virgin forever, it's just not true for most people. It just takes a lot of work to kind of get there, especially if you have social anxiety. But you could get there, guys. I don't know, I believe in you. I know you hate me, you hate my videos. It's fine. But I just wanted to kind of highlight that and illustrate it. I know I'm gonna get hate for that. And of course, the incels are gonna point out the irony and the fact that my next section is literally talking about false sexual assault allegations and the downfall of the Me Too movement. They're gonna be like, well, Claire, like, you literally just tell me to go get laid. Well, what if I get laid and a girl falsely accuses me of rape? Yeah, I know, I kind of walked myself into that one. Most women would not do that, though. Obviously, it's only a very small percentage of women who do this, but that is what I'm gonna be talking about in my next section, #MeToo and false sexual assault allegations. And naturally, whenever you talk about this topic, a lot of women, namely feminists, but a lot of women in general, will immediately say like, oh, people only bring up false accusations in order to diminish real victims' experiences, in order to shift the conversation to something else because you're gaslighting victims of sexual assault. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm not talking about it in relationship to actual sexual assault. I'm talking about it in and of itself because it's something that is very unfortunate. It happens and it needs to be talked about because there are certain societal factors that are increasing these kinds of behaviors that make it more appealing for people to make false allegations of sexual harassment or assault or abuse based on the way that other people who most likely are real victims have gotten treated as a result of sharing their own stories. So please don't take the fact that I'm talking about this as an attempt to diminish real victims, to try to make women seem like liars, to try to be a misogynist. That's not my intent at all. One of the main focuses actually of why I care about these false accusations so much is because besides the innocent men who are framed, who it hurts the most are legitimate victims of sexual assault and rape and abuse. Because unfortunately, when people make false allegations, particularly on social media or in the news or on the mass scale, and those are proven false and the person is clearly lying, it kind of reduces the legitimacy for so many people whose statements are actually true, for people who have actually suffered horrific abuse and are actually trying to get justice for said abuse. The more liars that there are, the less people take actual victims seriously, and this is why this is so upsetting. But also, these kind of allegations have been going on for a very long time. America has a very dark, dark history of white women literally accusing black men of rape falsely out of racial hatred or in order to get them lynched or punished or admonished from society. This is something that pretty much everyone is aware of, women falsely accusing black men of rape in order to express racial hatred and further segregation and racial discrimination. For instance, the Emmett Till case, which is not even a false rape story, the woman literally accused him of whistling at her in a grocery store, which is like not even illegal, not even harassment in my opinion. And by the way, it's been said that she later redacted that statement anyway and was literally lying. But even though this was in the mid-1950s, this accusation of a literal 14-year-old boy whistling at her in a grocery store led to him being lynched, literally lynched. And the reason I bring that up is just to highlight that these kind of false allegations have been going on throughout history. Even if you look at the Salem witch trials, the witch hunts, like literally just masses of people making false statements. And then in the 1990s, we've also seen some high-profile cases of people framing their own rape and pretending to be raped and trying to sue people, most likely for money. And this just kind of shows how false allegations can be used to gain power within a society, because people will naturally sympathize and empathize with you if they feel like you are a real victim of a horrible thing. And so the reason I wanted to talk about the Me Too movement is because it's something that I feel like started out with really noble intentions. I mean, literally Bill Cosby, which unfortunately he got released on like a technicality, devastating, but Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein literally were put into jail and like actually accused and convicted of sex crimes as a result of the Me Too movement. That movement was really important in getting these chronic sexual abusers out of their powerful positions and actually having to face accountability for their actions. And that's fantastic. But unfortunately, as we have all seen, the movement kind of crumbled. It got watered down, first of all, to where everything is a Me Too-able offense. Matt Damon famously made that tweet where he says, we have to admit slapping someone's ass and like raping someone are two different crimes with very different degrees of like harm to them. And people would respond saying, you can't compare traumas, you can't do that, you can't say that being raped is worse than seeing a penis. Like, yeah, you can. Literally everyone knows that. No one would choose to be raped over seeing a penis. But unfortunately, within the Me Too movement, people would allege things like, he looked at my tits for too long, as being on the same playing ground as people who are suffering real sexual abuse. And people attribute the downfall of the movement to the Aziz Ansari allegations and how he was basically Me Too'd for not doing anything criminal. He didn't sexually assault anyone or anything like that. I guess this woman just had an awkward sexual experience with him. And people immediately were like, this is going to be the downfall of the Me Too movement. And honestly, it kind of was. And this is not to say that people probably get Me Too'd, still today that actually deserve it and actually did commit crimes. But when something gets this much media attention and so much power is wielded by an accusation, people are likely to abuse it. A very small minority of people are going to abuse it for their own advantage. And then another event that got a lot of people critical of the Me Too movement, of course, is the Amber Heard Johnny Depp situation, which is still ongoing. So everything I say here is alleged. But basically, Amber Heard accused Johnny Depp of domestically abusing her. There are literally phone records showing where she states that she hits him, that she's hit him, that she starts physical fights.
I didn't punch you, by the way. I'm sorry that I didn't hit you across the face in a proper slap, but I was hitting you. It was not punching you. Babe, you're not punched.
No, when you fucking have a closed fist.
You didn't get punched. You got hit. I'm sorry I hit you like this, but I did not punch you. I was hitting you.
How are your toes?
What am I supposed to do? Do this?
How are your toes?
I'm not sitting here bitching about it, am I? You are.
Oh,
that's the difference between me
toes.
and you. You're a fucking baby.
Because you start physical fights?
You are such a baby!
Because
Grow the fuck up,
Because you start physical fights?
I did start a physical fight.
Yeah, you did, so I had to get the fuck out.
She literally has been convicted in the past of domestic abuse of a partner, whereas Johnny Depp literally has had all his long-term partners in the past come forward and say he's not a violent man at all. And there's basically a lot of compelling evidence out there to support the idea that Amber Heard literally domestically abused Johnny and then accused Johnny of domestically abusing her to try and deflect from the situation. And this basically brought attention to legitimacy of a lot of claims that are being made because people so automatically will just believe the woman in every circumstance when it's not that black and white. Unfortunately, there are people who will lie about horrible things for political gain or for financial gain or for clout. And the other thing I want to talk about when it comes to the Me Too movement, there was a list made, the Shitty Media Men list, if you remember that, by Maura Donegan, in which people could anonymously accuse people of sexual harassment, rape, literally anything under the sun, someone just being creepy or making you feel uncomfortable. And there's a narrative essay that I'm going to link down below by a man named Mike Tunison, who was falsely accused of, I think, stalking someone or harassing someone or something very vague, and he literally doesn't know who accused him, but it's literally resulted in him not having freelance jobs. The accusations were alleged to have happened over 10 years ago, and he literally has no idea what happened. And a lot of other people, in that list, there was like 70 people on it. A lot of them claim that they were falsely accused of various allegations. And I believe right now the creator of the list is going through a lawsuit in terms of libel, but it's very difficult because she's not the one who made every accusation. It was anonymous sources. And the reason why in this case I feel like these anonymous accusations can be so harmful is because we all know that when people aren't being watched, when they don't have to be held accountable, when they don't have to put their name to something, they're more likely to act in kind of sociopathic manners. They're more likely to lie for their own benefit. Everyone knows on Twitter and on YouTube, people who have anonymous profiles can leave the most vitriolic, hateful messages because they feel immune to consequence. And if you're working in an office and you happen to not like someone for some reason, whether valid or not, and you know that there's a list out there and you can accuse them of something very minor, like, he stared at me for too long, or he said some kind of comment, whether or not it's true, and you know that they're going to get fired for it, it can be a tempting thing. I'm not saying I would do it, but I'm just saying I understand how that temptation would exist when you mix anonymity with total consequence and action. Because the thing about the Me Too movement is that being accused is just as bad as being guilty. It really doesn't matter whether you're guilty or not. So many people on that list were immediately fired from their jobs, regardless of due process or them being proven innocent or anything like that. And of course, this whole Me Too movement, it's very complicated. I'm obviously not saying it was totally bad. Like I said at the beginning, some good things have happened from the Me Too movement. Obviously, discussions should be had around, the sexual relationships between men and women and, what counts as harassment or stalking and what doesn't, what counts as sexual abuse, what doesn't. These are important conversations. But unfortunately, there are opportunists everywhere. And if someone sees immense power being waged by making accusations, the ability to get someone fired, particularly if it's someone above you and you feel like you could take their position, the ability to get a settlement lawsuit for lots of money if you falsely or righteously accuse someone of some kind of sexual misconduct. There could be really large monetary gains for that, particularly if that person is a celebrity. And while most people, at least in my opinion, are good people and would not lie about something so egregious, these people do exist. This is something, unfortunately, that has been happening forever. But with the Me Too movement and with social media, I feel like this has been completely amplified. And so for my last section, how I feel like trauma and victimhood, when they're legitimate, should be viewed, I think our society places too much emphasis and priority on victimhood rather than overcoming victimhood. And I feel like if there was more, praise for the growth process for people who have overcome things rather than people currently going through things, there would be less false allegations. People would be less likely to use trauma as a way to gain social points and social currency. Cancel culture wouldn't be as big of an issue. There would be a lot more, in my opinion, that would be good for society. Trauma is not a virtue in and of itself. Overcoming it can be a virtue. Victimhood is not a virtue in and of itself. Dealing with and overcoming victimhood can be a virtue. I don't understand why these things are seen as virtuous in and of themselves when they're actually just horrible things that, unfortunately, certain people have to deal with. And it's really unfortunate that, with so much power attributed to victimhood status, people are literally abusing it to gain power, social currency, to shut down other people, to censor speech. I know I talk about it in every video, but with the cancel culture people, they literally use their own offense as justification for censoring other people and trying to destroy other people's reputations and careers, and for acting in really aggressive and volatile manners towards other people and having no empathy for other people because they feel so self-righteously justified in their own anger and offense, regardless of whether or not someone, said something that's actually offensive to them. Because when trauma is subjective and victimhood seems to be subjective, it's something that can literally be utilized by anyone with the most nefarious motives possible. And I hope this video doesn't come across as me being crass or mean to people who are legitimate victims of actual horrible things or have gone through actual traumatic experiences, because that's not my intention at all. Like I said earlier, my biggest gripe when it comes to these false allegations is how much it hurts actual victims, how much it delegitimizes people who have actually gone through horrific things. And when literally anything can be described as trauma just based on your own subjective feelings about it, this kind of also hurts people who have actually been through traumatic experiences. And as always, if you're struggling with your mental health or if you're going through something traumatic, I highly recommend therapy. I highly recommend professional help. I highly recommend getting off of social media and the internet, honestly, particularly if you're in some of those groups, like I mentioned on Tumblr and Tik Tok. There are ways to get through things. Humans are very resilient creatures. They can get through a lot. The world isn't over. It's okay. You can get through this. I'm not trying to be too cheesy here. I'm just trying to, end the video on a more positive note because I recognize that this video is negative. I mean, it's a critical video. It's kind of what I make. But in conclusion, as always, let me know what your thoughts are down below. I'd be interested to hear about it. Do you think this is a big problem? Do you think it's overblown? Why do you think this is the case? Do you think this will blow over and something else will emerge? If so, what? I'd be very curious to know. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It really means a lot. Give it a like if you liked it. That also helps me a lot. And leave a comment. If you're subscribed to my channel, then I will see you guys with my next upload. Again, just thank you so much for watching. And yeah, I hope this didn't come across as too harsh because, well, it probably did. But can't do anything about it. Anyways, thank you so much, you guys. I will see you guys next time.